Hey everyone, welcome to our Mad Men finale special. I'm Vladimir Duthiers and I'm joined by CBS News contributor Jamie Wax, Jason Lynch from Adweek, and from our Washington, D.C. bureau, Megan Garber, staff writer from The Atlantic. Mad Men made its final television appearance Sunday night.
That's right, and after 92 episodes, the hit show came to a dramatic end, jam-packed with surprises. Now, spoiler alert here. Here's a look at what happened last night and how much the series impacted its fans. With the word Om, Mad Men's emotionally tormented Don Draper finally appeared to come home to a state of inner peace 70s style. We see him smiling on a mountaintop before cutting to a classic Coca-Cola commercial.
I like to teach the world to sing.
The Hollywood Reporter's Rebecca Sun watched the finale at a Los Angeles viewing party.
I loved the fact that they insinuated or implied that Don eventually went back to New York and then created one of the most iconic advertisements, ever.
I love you.
It was an episode full of self-realizations. Peggy finally balanced her ambitions with romance, finding her true love in the same office. Joan got out from under the thumb of the controlling men in her life by starting her own business.
This is Joan.
And despite her fight with lung cancer, Betty found peace with daughter Sally and hit Don with the hard truth about why he shouldn't raise their kids when she's gone.
I want to keep things as normal as possible. And you not being here is part of that.
This ending had been clear for a long time for Mad Men creator Matthew Weiner.
Oh, no, I know how the show ends.
Do you know how the show ends?
Oh, yeah, I know the show ends. I just don't know what people will think of it.
It was just beautiful. We got every emotional thing that we needed, and then we got the resolution plot-wise.
In the finale, the always guarded Draper broke down and cried, emotionally transformed by another man's confession about his invisible, meaningless life. Over 7 seasons, Mad Men itself had its own transformative effect on how we saw the 60s and ourselves.
I think the 60s are probably, the single most turbulent decade in our country's history. And to see how some of them were able to ride that cultural wave is really fascinating for us now.
All right, so this is considered by many people one of the top 10 greatest television shows in the history of the medium. Let's get right to the finale last night. Jamie, what did you think of the finale? What was your favorite scene?
I thought it was great. I thought it had the quirky pacing, the odd habit of introducing new characters late in a wrap-up, which we just talked about.
Leonard.
This guy, yes, Leonard, who felt like he was on a shelf in the refrigerator.
Right.
And you're actually looking at your watch or the timer on your television going,
there's 3 minutes left or whatever, yeah.
Are you kidding me? I loved a lot of things that wrapped up some sort of storylines and some relationships between characters. I have to say, I really liked seeing Roger and Joan together and having some closure on what they meant to each other. I thought that was a personal favorite of mine.
Megan, what about you?
I loved, the Joan and Peggy togetherness I thought was great. I always loved the scenes with them together, and just to have them sort of interacting and sort of figuring out their future sort of in relation to each other, I thought was very cool.
Were you shocked that Peggy didn't go for, everybody on Twitter was saying, Olsen Harris, make it happen, make it happen. Like, weren't you so psyched when you heard, like, Joan throw that out, and then when Peggy essentially chooses love, like, were you bummed?
I was at first a little bit bummed, but then when I thought about it, I actually preferred that they go their separate ways. It actually seemed to make sense, and I loved that Joan just went out completely on her own. I thought that was so meaningful. She's had such a really cool story arc over the seasons that, for her to just be on her own, without men, without anyone else, I thought was very good. So I actually applauded it in the end.
What about you, Jason? What was your favorite scene last night?
Well, I liked a lot of the ones we mentioned, but there were 2 other ones that really stood out to me. And the first was Don's closing conversation with Betty, which could be the last time that those 2 characters ever spoke before. Betty has been a much maligned character throughout this series, and Matt Weiner has really did her a great favor these last 2 episodes. Not by killing her, but by finally giving her this meaty material that January Jones did an incredible job with it, and who would have thought? And I thought that the finale conversation was even better performance for January Jones than last episode's conversation. The other scene that resonated with me was the final Don and Peggy phone conversation. Yeah. That relationship had really been the backbone of the entire show. Remember, the show begins on Peggy's first day in the office. Right. And the fact that they had closure and that Peggy was the one to finally get Don to open up and admit I've done these horrible things to my wife. I've done these horrible things to my child. And Peggy was the only character who could have gotten Don to that place.
And to that end, Stan essentially saying you got to let him go doesn't mean you stop caring about him, but you just can't always sort of be there the way that you have been for the last 10 years.
Yes. Which is how the viewers feel.
Exactly. You're right, probably. I also agree with you. I think, Jason, January Jones got a lot of people that were angry at her throughout the entire run of this series for a variety of reasons. I thought Betty was a great character. I thought she was a great actress for that character. I remember one of my, and this just came to me when we were just talking about this, one of my favorite scenes when they went to Italy. And it seemed to me like that's the Don and Betty who fell in love with each other. And they were together and they looked great and they, were sitting at that table having jokes and laughing. She was a fantastic character, and I do feel like the fact that she has cancer is almost, in my estimation, a way to repay all those viewers, all the people on social media who had such animosity towards Betty, effectively giving her cancer. I mean, that's just the way I read it to it. That's my fan. I don't know, Megan, what do you think?
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think, too, I mean, and she's such a great character in so many ways because in some ways she calls the bluffs of the culture. Women are told to be beautiful. They're told to care about their clothes, to be, in some sense, very superficial. And that is exactly what Betty does. And, if audiences don't like that about that's actually kind of something that we should all examine about ourselves. So I loved her as a character, and I loved the way that her story ended, too, even though it was sad.
And what do you guys think about the fact that she is dying of lung cancer? We can not be sure that it's from cigarette smoking, but cigarette smoking has played a huge role in this series. Lucky Strike being the first big, sort of ad. I mean, they owned it. Roger owned that account, right? That was what they were all about in the early scenes. What do you think it says about smoking, about Lucky Strike, about advertising?
I think it's consequences. I mean, Jason brought up the fact that Don finally owns up to all of these things on the phone. This is a guy who lives without consequences on some level. Pete tried to do that as a character and found that wasn't the way for him. I think it's another beautiful creature or beautiful aspect of his life, or beautiful thing that Don killed somehow. I think that's sort of the metaphoric consequence there to this man who sells cigarettes. I mean, we have a lot of images of Betty smoking throughout the series. And then there is an actual consequence. We're getting into another era.
I feel also, and I'm thinking about if this season did justice to the characters as we've come to know them over the last 7 years. And I personally love the scenes with Roger and Marie because Roger, I've always loved Roger. He's my favorite character on the show because Roger and Joan, to a lesser extent, feel to me as if they knew exactly who they were. They weren't running from who they were the way Don and even perhaps Peggy in some instances trying not to be the kind of, the ingenue that she was. Roger always knew that I'm a philanderer. I have a lot of money. I like to drink. I'm really good at making, ad copy. And I'm not going to shy away from that. Even when I get busted, he always has the look of kid in a candy store or, busted with his hand in the cookie jar. And finally, last night, to see him with a woman of his age and realizing that he actually can love somebody of his age and be happy with her, I thought was also really a great scene between the two of them. But do you guys feel that these characters, where they ended up last night, is where we intended them to be, or where Matthew Weiner intended them to be?
Well, I do. I mean, I feel that Matthew Weiner has said many times, and when I interviewed him, one of the things that he said is that this television show is about how many times we get in our own way. And I think on some level, the characters got out of their own way. They got to what they actually wanted and stopped trying to put things in the way of that. And I think that was true of every character arc, really.
What was striking to me is that unlike any recent series finale, this last episode was set up to be a case where really anything could have happened. Breaking Bad had to go down to whether Walter White was going to die or not. Sopranos had to go down to whether Tony Soprano was going to die or not, although depending on how you interpret the finale, we still don't know. Whereas Mad Men was much more open-ended, so it really did give Matthew Weiner a lot more freedom of where these characters could go, and it almost didn't matter what the last moment with a lot of these characters was, because it was really more about the journey, much more than the destination. Again, with this show, much more compared to Breaking Bad or even Justified or something where everything was building toward a finale and how things played out.
But then why introduce so many characters at the last minute? I'm talking about the waitress, Diane, if that's her name, Diane, right? Why introduce a character like that, Megan, if you're not really, there's no closure there, it just seems sort of out of left field?
Yeah, I mean, I think in some sense the show is just sort of playing with its fans. It knows how much, we all had expectations and theories and all of this, and to introduce these people, and we don't know why they're there or where they're going to go or going to take other characters. It does just sort of have a little bit of fun with us and our expectations, which I found frustrating until I found it really awesome.
Well, that seems to be his MO, right? Matthew Weiner's MO. He clearly toys with his audience, and I almost feel like, just like The Sopranos in a way, that this was a series, but it was sort of like life goes on after the camera is turned off, and when we're not there with these characters, their lives continue. We may miss some instances, which is why a waitress can pop up in Don Draper's life all of a sudden.
Right.
He talked about that with you several times.
He did. I mean, the interview that I did with him was last spring while he was writing this episode, and it was just after the much acclaim and success of the final episode of Breaking Bad. And while he admired what they did with that show, he said outright, mine's not going to be that clean cut, and there's going to be some difficulty. I think we have a piece of that interview right now where he talks about losing characters and who might stay. So you talk about this balance of leaving people wanting more, of characters, of plot, and as you move through the stories, some things that were important to viewers that you may or may not have realized were left behind.
Sure.
As you contemplate wrapping this all up, do you think about those characters and plot lines that were left behind and maybe incorporating them in the ending?
I tell you how important the audience is to me, and then, like, half of it is like, I can't get a clear message from them. I cannot be led by them. They are very capricious, and, sometimes the dumbest people have the loudest voice, and so you just can't take that cue. But you do get a sense at a certain point, even when you're watching it, like, I had no idea Bob Benson would be that interesting to people. I just didn't know that. I'm not going to lie. He was interesting to me. He served his purpose. I'm not trying to act superior that I think he was, unimportant. I had a story that involved him humiliating Pete in the finale. I knew that from the beginning, that, I knew that Megan was going to start off as a secretary and end up as Don's wife. The audience, good or bad along with that, what a fascinating story for me to be able to tell. I love the fact that because we don't have these gigantic plots, that I can commit to the changes that people make, that I commit to Peggy being a girl from the sticks, even though it's Brooklyn, and finding Manhattan, and looking for a role model, and acknowledging at some point that she is a woman and that these things are limited, and then ignoring it. Just the idea of where people started and where they ended up. That's the big plot for me. That's the part where I'm like, wow, I got to really do like a big, big, big plot. But I don't know how it works by the episode. I don't know what to tell you. There's a lot of silence in it that was always made that you would have the experience that they're having. There's a kind of, I'm sure there's some medical definition of what that state is, when you're kind of hypnotized into a show. I wanted the show to have that. I will not please everybody, but I want the audience to understand that's not because I think I'm smarter than them. It's just, it can't be done.
That's a great point. It can't be done. Right. And yet he had millions of fans. This show had millions of fans. And full disclosure, my girlfriend always makes fun of me because I was a fan of this show even before it premiered. I read about it in the Hollywood Reporter, and I thought, this sounds so cool because it's going to be set in the 60s or late 50s, early 60s. So for me, the clothes, I was immediately drawn to the fact that the set design and the costumes design was going to be absolutely awesome. And yet, it snowballed into something that was tremendously vibrant and vital for most of the country. What do you think about Mad Men made so many people connect with it, Jamie?
I think it was a combination of two eras that needed to be linked. It was its time. Sometimes there's a cultural phenomenon that connects us to something good and bad about ourselves. And what he did was he lured us in with the fantasy and all of the sexiness of the whole era.
The smoking, the cocktails.
And then he made us care about these characters, and then we got to decay our own dream of what the show was while it fell apart for them.
What about you, Jason?
I would agree with a lot of what you said, but I would also take it a little further. When Mad Men debuted back in 2007, it debuted a month after The Sopranos finale, which Matt Weiner was also involved in. And I think The Sopranos kind of primed us to be ready for a show like Mad Men. And after Sopranos went off the air, HBO didn't really have another series like that to kind of hook everybody in, and we were all eager for another show that was just, more than surface, was a show that we could really sink our teeth into and talk over And Mad Men was that show. So I think that is a combination of a lot of the points you made, but we were also primed for this show to exist when The Sopranos went off the air.
Megan, do you think that that's a part of it as well, that people were just hungry for something like this and Mad Men filled a void?
I think so, definitely. I mean, just the fact that Weiner, appreciates the intellect of his audience. That was such a rarity for TV for so long, and just to be respected as a TV watcher, I think was huge. So yeah, it definitely, there was the void filling, but it was also it was its own literary product, and I think people are always going to respond to that.
I agree. I think that's right. Sorry, Jim, you were going to say.
No, what's funny is that we all felt about The Sopranos that it was sort of slow and existential and psychological about human want and the soul. It was so unusual for a film, much less for a television series. Now, if you watch The Sopranos compared to Mad Men, it's like an action film.
That's right.
It's really amazing.
It's true. It's very. It was less about. I think initially people thought it was going to be about the ring-a-ding-ding lifestyle, cocktails and smoking and pretty girls and handsome guys. But in fact, it ended up being so much more, and not so much even about advertising, although that plays obviously a huge role in the scripting, but about how people lived through an entire decade. And I thought that was really interesting. So listen, when we come back, we're going to take a look at some of the things we didn't like about Mad Men specifically. Stay with us. We'll be back in 90 seconds. I don't know if there's a lot of things that we can say we didn't like.
Well, that's all right. Well, we can talk about that.
Welcome back to our Mad Men finale special, and I want to talk about, we spent a good chunk of this broadcast talking about the things that we loved, and we clearly, what's nice about doing something like this is I'm talking with a bunch of fans. We're all fans of this show, even though it's our job to sort of review it and to criticize it, but we're all fans, makes it fun. But there must be some things in the 7 years that this show was on the air that we didn't like. So Megan, let me start with you. What was it that, if you think about the entire run of the series, you would have liked to have seen differently?
Yeah, I mean, this was something that happened a lot at first, especially, but just the sort of ironies, of history. Oh, look, women who are pregnant smoke cigarettes and this kind of thing, and which was interesting and which made the show delightful to watch. But also, I think they were so sort of self-congratulatory about pointing out those ironies that it got to be a little bit much sometimes.
For me, the trope that Matt Weiner went back to too often for me was that he had certain characters that he loved a lot more than the audience loved. When we've talked about Betty before, I mean, Betty certainly came into her own by the end, but a character like Glenn, who was played by his son, who he brought back every year, just kind of a creepy kid. I remember when he popped up this season, I was like, oh,
yeah,
Glenn's here.
He's back, yeah.
So there was that. There was, there was Megan, who again was a character, Zooby Zooby Zoo was one of, the great moments of the show. After that, she became very difficult, as far as just a character to really enjoy. And Matt Weiner just kept bringing her back, bringing her back. So I do, while I do admire him for kind of, sticking to his guns and really making the show that he wanted to make, there were certain characters that I feel like maybe he misjudged a little bit, how the audience felt about them.
We also talked about how much we miss Sal. I mean, you and I were talking about how we miss Sal. He was in the first season. He was a closeted homosexual man working at this ad agency. He had a sort of a pseudo marriage going on, and that character, he was, I think, very loved by the early fans of the show.
Absolutely.
And went away without any explanation or other than that incident with the tobacco executives.
It was a rich plot line that had only just started to deliver, and it delivered some bombs in one season. Probably the most exciting moments of that last season of Brian Batt's time on Mad Men were Sal's moments, were these different crises that came up. And it's just part of this attrition that happens when Matthew Weiner decides he's going to be existentialist, he's going to be character-driven and not plot-driven. And that's my only regret about, as a fan of the entire series, is there are so many of these moments where we bring Glenn back for the 5th time, or Megan, as interesting as she was, you're spending half an hour in an episode on her life in L.A., and you're thinking, and you're not going to bring Sal back, and just let us know what happened to the dog that walked out onto Madison Avenue. You're not going to wrap anything up for us, but this infuriation also makes you feel sort of bonded. It's like loving a difficult person. You feel a little more bonded to this show because it's hard to love in some ways.
And I also feel, and I know we've been talking to our executive producer Moshe about this, but I was never really a fan of Pete Campbell. Now I know and we were saying during the break that the true pinnacle of art, somebody once said, is that if there is controversy, if you have people who love it or hate it, then you've really achieved what you're trying to do. So you can't have everybody love every character every episode, but I really never liked Pete, and I was not happy that Pete got what he wanted, because Pete is from like he's born in with a silver spoon in his mouth. You know, he had the beautiful wife played by Alison Brie, and yet at the end he gets everything that he, you know, I don't know. What did you think of Pete?
It was a surprising turn of events. I mean, I think it was clear to everyone that Pete was on the road to ruin. He was being painted as a villain, a wannabe Don
in
Draper.
the beginning, right? Yeah,
that's right.
And he knew the secret. He found out Don's secret early on, that Don had, you know, was Dick Whitman and had somehow co-opted this guy's name.
I thought he was a clear villain, and that's part of the brilliance of this show, is you just can't tell where things are going to work out. He was on a run, as they said. He was doing all right. Things were going well in his life, and he sort of, as I said earlier, got out of his own way, stopped trying to be Don Draper, and all of a sudden everything fell into place for him.
Megan, Pete Campbell, love him or hate him?
Yeah, I mean, I love to hate him, basically. No, but I also think, I mean, I at first, did not like that ending, and I sort of wanted the worst for him. But then I thought, you know, maybe in a different circumstance, he can be a really great guy. You know, if he's not under Don's shadow, if he has the freedom to sort of be the man that he wants to be on his own, maybe he'll become really awesome and, you know, a wonderful father. That's what I hope.
You had a lot of cultural touchstones within the series. The beginning of the series starts with the Kennedy inauguration, right? All these guys are for Eisenhower, and Kennedy gets elected. I remember that was sort of a big plot point. Then you go through a whole bunch of different, you know, touchstones. The airplane disaster that killed Pete's father, Mohawk, I think it was in Mohawk Airlines. There were a whole bunch of things that happened around them, but they almost seem to be stuck in a bubble, these characters. They created these ads that were meant to target Americans and to get them to buy things. And yet, the things that were happening around them in the country barely seemed to intrude on their lives. There was that instance during the assassination years that they sort of were glued to their TV screens, even Don. But I don't know, what do you guys think about this idea that these guys are creating these ads for people to enjoy life? And none of them seem to be enjoying their lives at all.
Well, certainly it was a theme that was introduced from the pilot when Don said, you know, what you call love was invented by guys like me to sell nylons.
That's right.
And I think, you know, certainly, you know, and you know, it comes full circle with however you want to interpret that last scene from the finale. You know, whether this Coke ad that everybody responded to for, you know, this inclusion and diversity and you know, was created by somebody to sell Coke, apparently. So certainly I think it was keeping in line with the themes of the show.
It's interesting too, Megan, that these guys would come up with these ads and they always represented an ideal, and none of them could achieve that ideal. I mean, Don's family life was terrible. Roger, you know, philanderer. I mean, Pete, you know, all these characters, these broken characters, yet they're out there trying to sell us a piece of the American dream. What did you make of that?
Yeah, no, I think that's such a good point. And that was one of my favorite parts of the show. I mean, we were talking before about sort of the literariness of the whole thing. And, you know, this idea that society has a certain set of expectations for us that we're supposed to strive toward and we're supposed to live up to. And it's really hard to live up to all of those. And I think that's, you know, these are the people that help set those expectations. And the fact that they are so flawed and so small in so many ways, I think is a pretty good indictment of the culture in a really interesting way.
Yeah, and I think it leads us to the discussion of the last scene of the finale. So for those who, if you're one of those folks in America who hasn't seen it, we don't want to spoil it for you, but essentially Don goes on this sort of yoga retreat and he's really at rock bottom, and all the things all of a sudden that had been on the internet, you know, Don becomes D.B. Cooper, and Megan becomes, you know, gets slaughtered in the Manson, you know, all that stuff went out the window when you see Don at this scene here, where he's sort of meditating and chanting Om, and then a smile on his face. There it is, a very beautiful smile, and then a cut to this famous commercial from my childhood, certainly, which is people on a mountaintop singing about Coke.
Yeah.
Right? Like to bring the world a Coke, and you know.
It's a new fantasy to sell.
And that girl there, Jamie, that girl is, people pointed out, the one in the pigtails is exactly a replica, or not a replica, but she represents a girl that he meets at that yoga retreat.
Impossible to be unintentional, for sure.
So what is your take?
I mean, my take was clear. For me, he found authenticity and then figured out how to market it. Here was a man who, the entire series was about him trying to find his soul. He broke down, acknowledged what he did, was at peace for the first time. That's the least tension you've seen in Jon Hamm's face ever in this series. And then found his soul and then figured out how to sell it. That's his commercial, in my opinion, that he's just dreamed up and is now going to change advertising.
But Megan, to Jamie's point, is that authentic if he experiences that, and it becomes a way to monetize what, for those people there that were serious about being there, and a lot of people in that period of time in the 60s, early 70s who really wanted to get in touch with themselves and move away from crass corporatism. Is it really authentic if he goes out and he makes a commercial about that moment?
Right. I mean, that's the question, and I think that's what made the ending so brilliant, is that you don't know. And the way that it was presented in the show, it was entirely ambiguous. It could have gone, I mean, he could have been truly enlightened and, you know, used that to sell products, or he, you know, could have been faking it the whole time, just like he's been faking so much of his life, and you just don't know. But I think it was a really good sort of, you know, just indictment of the way that we sort of treat products as something that can give us spiritual enlightenment, because, of course, you know, it's stuff, and it's probably not going to be able to.
Yeah, and yet, Jason, Peggy, and when he was talking to Peggy on the phone, she said, "Don't you want to come back and work on Coke?"
Yes.
Which to me makes me think that Don dreamt up. And by the way, we should point out that that ad for Coca-Cola was done by the real McCann Erickson.
Yes, McCann. Yes. So I mean, I was just about to mention that. Yes, so it really does tie in. And I think that when Don is talking to Peggy, he thinks that he does not want to go back. And I think I'm going to maybe kind of split the difference. And I do feel like that moment of enlightenment was both personal, but also maybe a little more realizing, oh yes, I have this brilliant idea, and I'm going to go back and make a ton of money. And for all we know, maybe that's his last ad. He goes back with a, you know, goes out with a bang. But yeah, it was a great ending.
Final question: in the pantheon of great television shows, if we're measuring it against The Wire, against Breaking Bad, against The Sopranos, those types of shows, even Seinfeld, where do you put this show, Jason?
It's tough. I mean, I think it's tough, especially without having some distance, because I really feel, you know, The Wire was a show that I certainly loved at the time, but I've even grown to appreciate more. Breaking Bad is another show I'm dying to go back and watch from the beginning, just because of how much was paid off and all the seeds were planted. And I want to do the same thing with Mad Men. I mean, I think all of those shows you mentioned are kind of are in the pantheon toward the top. You know, as far as specific rankings, I think it's still too early to tell. I mean, Mad Men is, you know, fresh in our minds, and it was a great show. It was definitely one of the best, but I'm not ready to say it's better than or worse than The Sopranos quite yet.
It'll age well, right, Jamie? It'll age well?
I think it will. I think it's in both the flaws that we've talked about that may not be flaws in the grand scheme when we have some distance from it. I think it's the most important piece of storytelling in film, television, or theater, in a way, about being purely character-driven, even when you go off track of your plot. There's never been anything in theater, in film, in television that spent this many hours telling a story that meanders like this, that is driven by its characters in odd moments and loses important characters on a whim. I think it's very, very important in that regard.
Megan, you're nodding your head.
Yeah, I would agree with that, definitely. I mean, I would probably say top 5, but I think just the fact that we can talk about the idea of a pantheon and sort of a canon for TV, you know, a lot of that can be attributed to Mad Men and to, you know, the shows like it, that, you know, it allows us to talk in those sort of epic and sweeping terms about, you know, what television can do, which I think is really cool. So regardless of, you know, where it would, you know, technically rank, I think we all owe it a debt for that.
All right, I want to thank Jamie Wax, Jason Lynch from Adweek, and Megan Garber from The Atlantic. Mad Men is over, but CBSN is back in just 90 seconds.